not what we used to be. We're supposed to be different. You were lost, you were sinners, but in Christ, you're under construction. He's making something different and something better out of you. People have a tendency to get nostalgic about the good old days before we became Christians. We've all probably done that. We've all probably thought about, things that we used to do without even having a second thought about it. But now that we're Christians, we can't do it. We kind of think, it's kind of nice to be able to kind of do those things and not really think about them. Tendency to kind of go back and think about the good old days. The problem with thinking about the good old days is they really weren't all that good. Because at that time, Paul says, you were separate from Christ, you were aliens from the covenant, you were cut off from Israel, you were without hope, you were without God in the world. But look at what God has done for you. And so as Christians, we're constantly put in the position of having to remember the past and say no to the sin that we used to be involved in and say yes to God. We're constantly in the position of making that decision. It starts with changing your way you think, and it ends in decisions about how you're going to act. Just saying no to sin and saying yes to God. When you hear the word holiness, what do you think of? Do you think of monks? Do you think of cathedrals, candlelit cathedrals? Do you think of choirs singing? Do you think of this kind of sterile religious experience that people often find in sanctuaries? What does holiness mean? When Isaiah began his ministry, he began it the year that King Uzziah died, when he saw a vision of God. And around God, he saw these angelic beings hovering around him and singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord, the Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." And Paul says, 2 Corinthians 3:18, one of my favorite passages, 2 Corinthians 3:18, we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory. Now, think about this. When the angels sing about the preeminent attribute of God, they don't say, loving, loving, loving. They don't say merciful, merciful, merciful. They don't say gracious, gracious, gracious. They say holy, holy, holy. All of those other things are attributes of God. And they're attributes we're supposed to emulate. But the preeminent attribute is holiness. The word holy at its core means distinct from, separate from, fundamentally different than. And Paul comes along and says, we're supposed to reflect the glory of the Lord that pervades the universe, according to Isaiah 6. We're supposed to reflect that glory as we're being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. God changes us from the inside. There ought to be a family resemblance. When people look at you and they look at me, they ought to see a resemblance that we look like Jesus. I like the way I thought that Randy Harris was through with his lesson a little earlier than he actually was this morning. But I like the way he ended that chapel talk. Did you notice how he ended that chapel talk? He's been talking about how we're supposed to be what God has called us to be. And he says, you're lights in the world. You're supposed to be what God called you to be. We reflect his glory. So, as Christians, we're not supposed to lazily slip back into those old grooves of evil, doing the things we feel like doing. That's why the Message translation puts 1 Peter 1:14. Don't lazily slip back into these old grooves of evil, doing just what you feel like doing. You didn't know any better then. You do now. There's a story about Alexander the Great you've all heard of Alexander the Great. From the age of 20, 21, 22 to the age of 30, he conquered the known world, all the way to India. He spread Greek culture across the world. He died at the age of 30, and the legend is that he wept because there weren't any more lands to conquer. Well, on one of his campaigns, there was a young soldier who deserted and was brought to Alexander. And that was unusual, because usually that was dealt with summarily in the field. You deserted, you got killed. They brought this fellow to Alexander, and I think you'll know why in a second. Because when they caught him, he made a big point of the fact that his parents had named him after Alexander. So they brought him to Alexander. And he tries to play on the fact that he's Alexander's namesake to get out of the penalty for desertion. Alexander's reported to have said to him, either change your name or change your ways. One or the other. You can't wear the name Alexander and behave like a coward. You can't wear the name Christian and behave like a pagan. We need to understand that there is this business of holiness that God expects of us, which is really making us whole, W-H-O-L-E. I read about a fellow from an African territory who got to come to the United States and visit, and he was just amazed at how all the cities were so lit up. Well, he had some spare money, and so he bought a bunch of switches and wires and sockets and bulbs, and he took them back to his village, and everybody wondered what he's going to do with all this stuff, and he says, just wait. And he took the wires and he strung the wires all over the village. And then he hooked the sockets up and he plugged the bulbs in, and he hooked the switches to the wires. And one day he told everybody, okay, come and see what I've brought for you. He flips the switch, nothing happens. Why? No source of power. It's unplugged. There's no connection. It's not enough to just turn the switch. You have to be connected to the Father. That's what shapes your darkness. That's what gives you the understanding of how to walk in the dark. Everybody knows C.S. Lewis is one of my favorites. He says this, how little people know who think holiness is dull. When one meets the real thing, it is irresistible. Even if 10% of the world's population had it, would not the whole world be converted before the year's end? Change the way you think. Change the way you behave. It's a matter of making choices. Just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy, for I am holy. Notice it doesn't say, be holy in most of what you do. It doesn't say be holy in almost everything you do. It says be holy in all you do, everything you do. You see, our convictions shape our choices. Convictions are beliefs that we hold firmly. It's the way we think that affects the way we behave. Our inner space gets conquered when our convictions shape our choices. I think one of the reasons that people fall away from the truth is because they get choked up by the cares of the world. You know, Jesus talked about those different kinds of soil. And there was soil where you planted the seed and it germinated and it sprouted, but then it died just as quickly. Sometimes it's because of being choked out by the cares of the world, the weeds. Sometimes because it didn't have any depth. There wasn't anything there to keep the water. As Christians, our motivation is not what is everyone else doing. Our motivation is what would Jesus have me to do? What does God want me to do? Conviction comes from a couple of places. For one thing, it comes from what the Scriptures say. This year, if you don't do anything else, spend more time in the Bible. It will shape the way you think. It will shape your choices. It will shape your life. It will turn you into what God has declared that you are, the light in the world. So when Peter's audience would ask the question, well, why should I be holy? Peter's answer would be, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. What's he doing? He's going back to the Old Testament. He's going back to an expression, it is written, that's found over 80 times in the Bible, that explains why people make the choices they do. You can't make the right choices if you don't have the Word dwelling in your mind so that you can say, it is written. That's the way Jesus defeated Satan at the temptations. And it's the way you'll defeat him, by saying, it is written. But you can't know it's written unless you've been reading it. But the second thing he says is, you got to be thinking about what's coming too. Verse 17. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. In other words, what happens to us in eternity is to some extent shaped on the choices we make here and now. Rewards are based, at least in part, on our deeds. Peter says as much in verse 17. God will judge or reward you according to what you do. What's your commitment this year to doing what God wants you to do? To being holy because He's holy. To being able to say, it is written, as an answer to any temptation you have. Paul puts it this way, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5. Judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God. Are there things in your life that you'd kind of like to keep hidden from everybody else? Keep hidden from God? You're not going to be able to keep things hidden forever. There is going to come a day of the Lord, a day of judgment. Read about a burglar who broke into a house. The house is dark, the people are gone. He breaks in, he hears a voice. Jesus is watching. Kind of startles him. He stays still a moment, decides it's just something in his head, starts moving around through the house. He hears the voice again. Jesus is watching. Third time this happens. He's been looking around with a flashlight. Finally, third time it happens, he just turns the light on. And he sees on a counter a bird cage. And he knows that this parrot is the one that's saying, Jesus is watching. Now, down by the bird cage, he sees a Doberman. And about this time, the bird says, "Sick him, Jesus." I'd say that was that. If you've read my book on Revelation, you know that I make the point that the day of the Lord comes to different people at different times. It's not always the end of time. This was his day of the Lord, Sick him, Jesus. Who would name his dog Jesus? I don't know. But it works in the story, doesn't it? If you want to walk firmly and confidently in a dark world, if you want to see in the dark, if you want to punch holes in the darkness, you need to think clearly. You need to live holy lives. You may need to choose decisively to do what God would have you to do. And then, contrary to what the rest of the world thinks, you won't be the oddball. You'll be the most enlightened person in your world. We mention every week that we have these communication sheets. Maybe there's something you want to share. Maybe there's a prayer need that you have. Maybe you need somebody to contact you and talk to you about something going on in your life. Write down in those the communication sheet, whatever it is that we can help you with, let us know how. And I'm going to have you pass those to the right aisle right now, because I always forget to do that. And they're going to be picked up. And